First of all, I'd like to thank the elders and the congregation for the opportunity to stand before you. I appreciate also Doug and Jonathan asking me to talk about this subject. For a long time, I felt there are some things that need to be brought to the attention of our congregations and our preachers, and I'm very thankful that I'm in a position perhaps to help with this. Now, as I received the assignment, it was the business side, making money, retirement, tax, and investment strategies. I struggled with that a little bit because I'm not a certified financial planner. And there's a lot of advice, a lot of help you can get from such a person that I really can't offer. What I am is an enrolled agent. That's someone who has passed a battery of tests that allows me to practice before the IRS. What that means is I can represent somebody who's in trouble with the IRS. Attorneys and CPAs can also do that. But I have learned over the years, as a preacher of the gospel, oftentimes the hard way, about the bad decisions and the good decisions that we all need to be making in terms of these subjects. Now, when I began doing taxes in 1997, it was out of economic necessity. I moved from Buffalo, Missouri to Ozark, Missouri, and I was making 2 house payments. So I had to come up with some way of making some extra money. And one of the brethren there owned an H&R Block franchise, and he got me trained. And every year at the end of the tax season, I think, that's it, I'm done, I'm out of here. But there's always a need, it seems like. Maybe there's some college tuition that needs to be helped with, or one thing and another kept me going. And eventually I realized that I was a valuable source for lots of people when it came to taking care of their taxes, and that includes a lot of preachers. Now, in the district where I work, there's only about 4 or 5 of us that do what the IRS calls clergy returns. There are others who attempt to, and they make a fine mess, a train wreck sometimes out of it, because they really don't know what they are doing. But there's all of us who are involved in it are either preachers or the wives of preachers. So the training was rather meager when I began with H&R Block, so I did a lot of educating of myself, and I'll talk about that as I go. I've chosen this title, Avoiding Problems with Your Finances and the IRS, emphasis on the IRS. A clever person solves a problem, a wise person avoids it. That's what we want to do. We want to avoid problems, and we can avoid taxes legitimately. I think it's a part of good stewardship to take advantage of the code so that we can lower our taxes. And on the other hand, evading taxes or doing things to get us out of paying taxes that are not according to the law, that is certainly not appropriate. Here's our outline for our study. I'm going to begin by talking about the biblical view of taxes, and I'm going to talk about something that came on my radar just recently as a result of some continuing education about tax preparation. I'm going to talk about some things that I would recommend to congregations and some things that I want to recommend to preachers, and then we'll end with questions. Obviously, we always do. Now, there may be some general questions you want to ask during that time period, and we'll do that. But if you have a specific question relating to your specific need, you are welcome to contact me in private outside of this venue, and I'll be glad to give you all the help and advice that I can. Because, there are some things that you would rather just keep out of the public eye. And that's true of all of us. Now, this little mug I saw one time, and I thought, whoa, isn't that true? We all use experiences in life to inform our teaching. That didn't show up very well over on the other side there. But what it is saying, and I will tell you what it says on the right-hand side of the screen, is I am not going to be using any examples from my experience with brethren and with congregations in my talk as I illustrate some of the points I make, with the exception of myself and the congregation of which I am a part. Let's look at the biblical case for paying taxes. I know people in southwest Missouri who believe it is a righteous thing to not pay their taxes. And if they're ever caught up with by the IRS, then they will have substantial penalties and fines and maybe even jail time to pay for it. The Bible tells us in Matthew chapter 22, verses 15 through 21, about the time the Pharisees came trying to get Jesus in trouble. Who wants to pay taxes to the Gentiles, the Romans? On the other hand, you had the Herodians, who were very much in favor of that. They thought they could get Jesus in trouble by getting him to take a stance. Very wisely, he said, "Render therefore to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's." And that, of course, lays the groundwork for all of our understanding about this issue. There are things that Caesar requires, and we are commanded to cooperate with that. The Bible also tells us in the book of Romans, chapter 13, verses 1 through 7, that render therefore to all their due, taxes to whom taxes are due, customs to whom customs, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor. Biblically, we are to pay our taxes. Peter says in 1 Peter, the second chapter, verses 11 through 17, that we are to submit ourselves to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake. Among the ordinances that we have to treat with are parts of the Internal Revenue Code that allow us to save taxes. And we ought to have a clear conscience about using these features of the Internal Revenue Code to save on our taxes. Now, another angle we have to factor into all of our thinking about this, whether it's money or taxes specifically, is we are commanded to be good stewards of what God has given us. The word steward, it referred to an individual who was in charge of keeping the community pigsty. And he took care of other people's property. He managed it. And virtually everything in this life is a stewardship of sorts before God. We have the responsibility of managing well what God has blessed us with. I've got a whole series of sermons on this subject, and I'm not going to preach them now, but you get the idea. Our time, our talent, and our treasure are all subject to the idea of good stewardship. And so we need to factor that into our thinking here. So here's the financial advice, and I'll get this up front, put out there for you to learn from. Some of these lessons, of course, I've learned the hard way. As I've told people, I've got a master's degree from the University of Hard Knocks, maybe even a doctoral degree. The first thing is stay out of debt to the greatest extent possible. The one debt that is certainly allowable is buying a home. But then you need to do what thankfully, with the help of my good wife, who hates debt like Attila the Hun hated the Roman army, we've been able to get the house paid off. And that's a very nice feeling to have a debt-free situation like that. Better be careful. I'll be spilling that. So stay out of debt. Especially be careful with the credit cards. You know, you got kids at home, and you've got an emergency that comes up, and your solution is pull out the plastic. But when you look at that, what you realize is your minimum payment's going to be 2 to 5%. The average interest rate is going to be between 21 and 25%. And if you had a $2,000 balance and you only paid $40 a month, you can actually see this on your statement. It's a part of what's been mandated by the federal government, appears on every credit card statement. It shows you how long it will take to pay off your balance if you paid just the minimum amount. Well, you'll wind up at the end of 10 years paying over $5,000. And you can see that not only on your actual credit card statement, but by using a calculator that you can easily find on the internet. But alongside that, you need to think about the future. You know, it's very easy to say, God will provide. Heard a story one time about a man who had his son-in-law, future son-in-law, come visit him. He wanted to sit down and have a talk with him. And so the son-in-law was apparently a student. He had a reputation for being a perpetual student and had no obvious means of support. But the father his future father-in-law, asked the young man, how do you plan to support my daughter and take care of your family? The Lord will provide. God will provide. That was his standard answer to everything that he was asked. So finally, the older man went and talked to his wife and said, well, guess what? We're going to be taking care of them. And that's the way a lot of people are kind of unreal about looking into the future. My statement to you is it doesn't matter how small. Now, most of your financial gurus will recommend that you pay yourself first. Well, I say, first of all, you take care of your contribution to the Lord and his church. And then you pay yourself. 10% is a good thing if you can. When you're young and poor and have kids that are being raised, it may be very difficult to do that, but you do what you can. And one of the best things you can do, I believe, from what I know about the investments that are available, is start a Roth IRA. A Roth IRA is a type of IRA where you put money into it, and you're limited now to, I think it's about $7,000 a year. And if you keep it in there for at least 5 years, and if you just let it grow, let's say you start that at 25 and you retire at 65 or your full retirement age, you've got that in there for 40 years. It's amazing what the compound interest is going to do to that. You might have $150,000 capital in that account, and then you might have $2 million in the bank. And according to the Roth rules, most of that is tax-free. The money grows tax-free. Now, you pay tax on the capital you put in there. But if you follow the rules and you retire, you have a very nice sum for your retirement. The other IRA that we're familiar with is the traditional IRA. In that arrangement, you deduct whatever you contribute from your gross income. So you're not paying tax on that money now, you're deferring it to the future. Similar to a 401k, which many of you may have or have had in the secular world, or a 403b, which is typically what would be offered by a not-for-profit institution like a school or something of that nature. It's an investment vehicle to save for the future. Now, I'm going to be referring to the authorities as I go through much of this. And here's one that I encountered as I educated myself years ago by Beverly Worth. Her husband was a minister, and back in the 60s, she saw that there was a lot of things that they just didn't know. And so she educated herself, became a tax preparer, became an enrolled agent, and eventually produced a very excellent guide on income taxes for ministers. She died in 2021. The 2020 version of this is the last one that came out. But if you can find a used copy someplace, and you probably can on Amazon or Thrift Books or something like that, I would get it. It is a condensed version of some of the other things that I'll talk about. Now, another one is, you might have seen this in years gone by, the Zondervan Minister's Tax and Financial Guide. It no longer is published, but it is still available. No longer published by Zondervan. It is now published by a group called the Evangelical Council for Financial Accountability, and it produces this Minister's Tax and Financial Guide. It's just a continuation. The author actually is one of the 4 authors that put together the Zondervan Guide. And so that is continuing. This is the Cadillac of all the resources available. I don't know Mr. Hammer personally, but I know a colleague of mine, who knows him personally. Back in the 60s, he got a law degree. He also became proficient at tax law, and he's a member of a certain large denomination that I won't name here, but I have observed in the tax returns I've done for people from that denomination that they are very astute and they are very much on top of what they need to be doing for their people, reporting the income and all the things that can be done to lower taxes. And this is a weighty book, but it is well worth the investment. I don't buy one every year, but about every 2 or 3 years, I buy the latest version. there's enough changes over 2 or 3 years' time it would repay investing some money in that. And of course, there's always the IRS. You can go to the IRS website and you will find a wealth of resources. We'll find more about this later in the talk. Now, the truth is, taxes are a little bit like Calvin Ball. The fellow who wrote the comic strip, Bill Watterson, said, "People have asked how to play Calvin Ball. It's simple. You make up the rules as you go." Congress makes the rules. And oftentimes, when there's a change of who controls the Congress, the rules get changed. That happened in 2017 when Trump was in office and the Republicans controlled the House and Senate. And as a result of that, we had the TCJA, Tax Cut and Jobs Act. And it changed taxes dramatically. There was a day and time when you combined your contributions and your mortgage interest and maybe medical bills or your taxes that you paid, we all did itemized deductions. Hardly anybody does itemized deductions anymore. That law doubled the standard deduction, and so very few of us are able to do itemized deductions anymore. That might change back after 2025. Those provisions, as well as many others, we won't take the time to get into now, could change. Congress changes its mind all the time. One thing I'll tell you about that's a change for the good is recent legislation during the Biden administration greatly enlarged the amount that you could get as a tax credit for energy efficient home improvements. I remember back in the 90s, there were lots of pretty rich energy efficient home improvements that were available. They went away for several years, and then they've come back. So you might want to look into that. Now, I'm going to say something here that is a rebuke to my past activities and maybe yours as well. Ignorance is not bliss when it comes to taxes, and ignorance of the law will not get you off the hook with the IRS if you run afoul of their rules. Now, on December the 13th, 1991, Friday the 13th, I went to my mailbox and I saw an envelope that had that IRS logo on it. Friends, brethren, you do not want to see an envelope with an IRS logo on it outside of the time you expect a refund check in the mail. That's just not good news, and it wasn't. I felt like it wasn't. It was an invitation to an audit. And they audited me, and I learned some lessons out of that, and I tell you, I was scared going into it, but it wasn't a bad experience. And the recent college graduate who was the auditor educated me about several things, and I came out of that feeling like, man, I need to do some reading and get on top of this. And a few years later, I had the opportunity to actually become a tax preparer. That's really when I took advantage of my thinking there and was able to make some changes for the better and have been able to help others as well. Now, recently, this came on my radar. I took a CE course on expanded enforcement, talking about the changes at the IRS we can expect to see over the next several years. This individual that presented said that the IRS history falls into three categories: 1776 to 1861, the revenue cutters, excise taxes, the Whiskey Rebellion, when the first excise tax this country created was a so-called sin tax on whiskey. It actually caused parts of western Pennsylvania to want to secede from the Union. Then in 1861, we have the beginning of the income tax, used to finance the Civil War. And off and on for the next several decades, it was in place, or sometimes at one point it was declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. So the 16th Amendment in 1914 fixed all that and made the income tax a part of the Constitution. Then what happened in 2022, actually, but 2021 is used as a date for figuring this third period. That's when the Biden administration gave a lot more money to the IRS and a lot more money in the so-called Inflation Reduction Act of 2022. You might have heard headlines. They're going to hire a bunch more IRS agents. They're going to do this, that, and the other thing. Well, that's pretty much true. And when Congress changed hands back to the Republicans, they cut out some of it. But the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022 is kind of a misnomer on the order of the Democratic People's Republic of North Korea. It's not democratic, it's not a republic, and it certainly isn't run for the benefit of the North Korean people. The Inflation Reduction Act is focused on two main things: promoting projects to aid with climate change concerns, billions of dollars, and $80 billion for the IRS. Well, how is the IRS spending this money? By the way, that was cut back by about $20 million when the Republicans got back in. I don't know if you can read that, but basically what it's saying is that they have hired a lot more people, and they're going to be hiring a lot more people. They have already added, they have increased their workforce from 79,000 to 90,000 in 2022. They have already hired 2,000 additional revenue agents. Those are the people who conduct audits. And they plan to grow by 14,000 more by 2029. And you know what? I don't think the Republicans are going to put too much of a cap on that, because the bottom line is, with the size of debt we have, all the money that the IRS can find is going to be counted a good thing. Now, their primary focus is going to be on the very wealthy, people above $10 million average annual income, or above $1 million, is what some of them say. We're not going to worry about that. There's plenty of attention the IRS is going to turn our direction unless we do some planning and preparing for that. So let's talk about congregations for a while. All churches are tax exempt per the IRS code, whether they have applied for a 501c3 status or not. There are some reasons why you might want to apply for a 501c3 status. This is a tax exempt status that is allowed for religious, educational, scientific, and other charitable organizations. There are some advantages to that. The chief one being, if you plan to do a lot of mail campaigning, you will get a nonprofit rate from the United States Postal Service. My first experience with this was in Corvallis, Oregon, when we did just that. We mailed out to the entire community. We first got a 501c3 designation, and that was a good work for us to do, and we found it very profitable. Publication 1828 will give you more information about that. But also, you can find these publications and others that I'll be mentioning by going to the IRS website. And as you can see from this particular screenshot, there is a search panel up there, and you just type in what you're looking for, and it will produce a list of results that will help you, and you'll see also up there in that dark blue line, forms and instructions. You can go there, and there used to be a day when people said the IRS publications read like insurance contracts. Well, thankfully, someplace along the line, they got some English teachers in there, and they got some readability experts in there, and they kind of fixed that problem. So, although things aren't easy, they are much better than they used to be. Now, a congregation is tax exempt, and that means, this is whether you've got 501c3 or not. You are a church. What makes you a church? Well, there's a whole list of regulations and tests that the IRS would apply. And the reason we have this is because on almost any point of the tax law, there are lots of bad actors out there who are going to try to use the rules to cheat the government. Well, in the 70s and 80s, there were a bunch of individuals who would pay some money to one of these online seminaries, or they weren't online then, they were mail-in seminaries, and they'd get a nice little piece of parchment that said they were an ordained minister. And they would set up their little church, and they would declare their home a church, and they would try to finagle the system so that they could avoid taxes. IRS caught on to all that, and they stomped that right into the ground. If you stomp on the IRS's toes, they're going to stomp on all your toes and fingers. I mean, that's the way they operate. If you show yourself to be insolently in violation of the law, I have to hurry. Well, this means, because your congregation meets the test, the primary thing you do that enables you to meet the test is you have worship services, and you support the preaching of the gospel. So contributions are treated as tax deductible if you're able to file a Schedule A, and gross income is treated as non-taxable, all the contributions received, and the assets are treated as non-taxable. Now, if you do the 501c3 and your annual income is less than $50,000 and your assets are less than $250,000, then all you do is file a postcard, and you don't even do that in the mail, you do it electronically. But now many of our congregations, especially in big cities, are going to have contributions that are more than $50,000 a year, and their assets, their building alone is probably going to be worth more than $250,000. And so you'll be doing a 990EZ. So be aware, when you get that 501c3 status, there's going to be an annual tax return. It's not difficult, but your treasurer or someone in the congregation or myself can help you fill it out. You might also want to look into your state's requirements for being a nonprofit organization in the eyes of the state. You can save on sales taxes. Now, let's talk about charitable contributions a little bit, because I've realized that in a lot of places, they don't really understand the substantiation rules. If you do itemize and claim it as a deduction, you need to have some kind of bank record. That would be a canceled check. Or you can have a letter from the people that you donated the money to saying they gave so much money. If you give $250 on any one occasion, then you have to have a written acknowledgement from the organization. It will include the name, the date, the amount, and the description. Now, we do this at Ozark, but I have discovered this is true of denominational churches, where I've done tax returns for their preachers. It's true of many of our congregations. They aren't really taking care of this like needs to be done. And this is what we hand out to somebody who gives on an individual Lord's Day more than $250 on that one occasion. The name, of course, the amount, the date, signed by the treasurer, and it identifies who the money was given to. This is something to look into if your congregation is not doing it. Now, we're going to talk about the support of preachers in a bit, but I want to emphasize record-keeping requirements and the standard warning when we're talking about handling money. Paul said about handling all that money that was being donated by the Gentile churches to go to Jerusalem and Judah, we take this course so that no one, several individuals, were going to be involved in carrying the money. They were going to serve as a check and a help to each other. Everybody was going to be honest and above board, not just in the sight of the Lord, but on the side of man, as he says there in verse 21. And so we need to bear that in mind. Now, in the interest of time, I'm not going to consider anything on this particular slide, but there are special rules limiting IRS authority to audit a church, but there are no such special rules for auditing preachers. There are certain things that will be red flags for the IRS, and we could talk more about that. I'll tell you one thing. It was the main thing that was wrong with my tax return that got audited. I had used a Form 2106, which is called an Employee Business Expense Form. That is something that kind of went the way of all the earth back in 2017 with the Tax Cut and Jobs Act. Before that, anything earned as an employee of a church could be deductible on your Schedule A after a certain levy had been reached, but no longer is that available to us. So there is another way to take care of that, and it's all to the preference of the IRS, and I think it works out better for us as well. We'll come to that directly. But the 2106 has always been a red flag, and at the same time, using solely a Schedule C, if you happen to be considered a dual status employee, can also be a red flag. So let's talk about, in the eyes of the IRS and the law, every preacher you support is either an employee for income tax purposes or a non-employee. What is the difference? This is based on the tax code and all those authorities that I mentioned. An employee is a preacher, a teacher, or an elder, one who labors in the work and word and doctrine and is supported by the congregation in some fashion. This person works with the congregation he receives support from. He should have his income reported on a W-2, but it's not your typical W-2. We'll see that directly. A non-employee is one who works on an occasional basis to fulfill a specific task. He holds a speaking appointment, a gospel meeting, etc. Yesterday, Nate and I went to Fossil Creek, and we had a speaking appointment, and those brethren supported us, and we're thankful for that. That income will go on a Schedule C, okay? And they may choose to send us a reporting document. The amount they gave us did not rise to the level of that reporting requirement, but nonetheless, they might choose to do so. So, a preacher who works with a congregation and receives support is identified by the law as a dual status employee. This is where a lot of my fellow preparers just blow their minds when they're thinking about what the IRS calls clergy taxes, what I'd call a minister or a preacher's tax. You're treated as self-employed for your Social Security and Medicare components. You are treated as an employee for your income tax component. So a preacher who works with the congregation is a dual status employee. We'll have more to say about this directly. But a congregation who has the occasional speaker or preacher who holds a gospel meeting is a non-employee. And if this individual is paid $600 or more in 1 year, then they must be issued a 1099 NEC by January 31st. And the IRS receives this information also. It's part of the checks and balances system to make sure that income gets reported. Now let me say this. If you don't get a 1099 NEC as a preacher, that doesn't mean you don't have to report that income. If you receive $10 in tips as a server in a restaurant, you have to report that. They want the income reported. You will report it by keeping good records that will substantiate both your income and your expenses. By and large, most of the income that the preachers that I've seen put on their Schedule Cs from what the IRS would call independent contracting is not reported to the IRS on a 1099 NEC or a 1099 miscellaneous, which was back before TCJA. It is just, there's your check. And you keep the records and you take care of reporting it. Yeah, this involves a little more bookkeeping and effort on the part of a congregation. But I think it's well worth the time. As I pointed out earlier, we expect enhanced enforcement in all areas of the IRS code. To date, I know of no congregation among us that has gotten in trouble for failing to give someone a 1099 NEC or for failing to give someone a W-2. But it's on the books. If you were a businessman, say you ran a plumbing business and you didn't give your guys W-2s and you didn't give your independent contractors 1099 NECs, there are substantial and expensive penalties. There was a fellow last year who started a business, didn't realize he had some payroll responsibilities, and when it was all said and done, all the debt that he accrued because of the penalties and interest put him under into business. That's a bad scenario. Ignorance is not bliss. This is what a 1099 NEC would look like. What you see up there is that this is an individual who has spoken maybe at a congregation a couple of times. He has $900 of non-employee income there. And this is turned into the IRS at the end of the year, actually early in the next year, on what is called a 1096 form. You'll see there are several boxes because there are several informational return type documents that can be submitted to the IRS using this form. If you have 10 or more NECs or W-2s, you must file electronically. That's another conversation. If you need advice and help with that, I can provide it. There's a way to do it without incurring any cost to yourself. You can literally go to the irs.gov website. So let's transition now in the remaining time, which is precious little, to talking about preachers. There are several special tax rules that apply to preachers. Ministers can qualify for a housing allowance that is designated in advance. Stress on in advance. When I go home, we'll have a business meeting at the end of the year in Ozark, Missouri, and they will designate my housing allowance and my expense account for the next year. It has to be done in advance. Ministers who rent their own home do not pay federal income tax on the portion of their compensation that is designated as housing allowance. They do pay self-employment tax on this amount, unless they are exempted from self-employment tax. We'll talk more about that in a bit. Ministers may exempt from self-employment tax. That's Social Security and Medicare tax, paid normally by a self-employed person, but also by a dual status employee, like a minister. If several conditions are met, this is very important, we'll talk about it in a bit. Ministers' employment status for Social Security is self-employed, income tax for income. Social Security and Medicare is paid as a self-employed person. If you work for an employer, you will see the FICA taxes among several types of taxes withheld from your pay stub. No doubt, like myself, you remember your first paycheck. And you looked at it, you'd already calculated how much money you were expecting to get, and oh, what happened? They took a bunch of my money away. Well, they took it out to pay taxes, Social Security, and Medicare. They weren't just going to pay you. I think my wages were like $3 an hour back in the day, the full amount. Some of it's going to be taken to pay taxes and other things. But the bottom line is there are some things that we need to talk about here, and I'm going to take them up one by one. There's been a legal challenge to the housing allowance. The Freedom from Religion Foundation sued in a court in western Wisconsin, and they won the case. But it went to an appeals court, and it was overturned. The appeals court argued, Congress has the right to make the rules, and the rules are ministers get a housing allowance. If you're interested in the history of that, you can ask me more about it later, but I have to hurry on. Some of this we've already talked about, but a housing allowance, these are several scenarios that we encounter. An evangelist who is fully supported by a congregation. He's considered a dual status minister, an employee for income tax purposes, and self-employed for Social Security and Medicare tax. A housing allowance is allowed. Expenses for work with the supporting congregation are no longer deducted on a 2106. They sure aren't put onto a Schedule C. What you have is an accountable plan. Basically, you turn in your receipts and you get reimbursed. Or if they want to designate a part of your income as your housing allowance, you just need to make sure that you spend it for expenses and not something else. My expense account at Ozark is at $500 a month or $6,000 a year. That kind of covers things in case I do fall short in a particular month. That's an easy thing for me to meet. If I drive 300-400 miles doing the work locally, and that's a very easy thing to do in Springfield, Missouri, I can easily be up to $350 just from mileage reimbursement. Then I buy my books and I have my office expenses. Most months I'm over $500 by the time I put all that together. And that $500 doesn't go anywhere as far as the IRS is concerned. If you were audited, you might have to produce the evidence. What you have to do is make sure that the congregation has access to that. I put everything in an envelope for the month, and it is stored at the church building. If the treasurer wants to look at it, he's welcome to, but you can have an agreement that Smith's got all of his paperwork here. Anybody can look at it if they want to, but that's how we meet that requirement for the accountable plan. There's a lot more to be considered there, but I really do have to hasten on. Sometimes we have traveling evangelists. This is kind of a thing of the past. This person is going to put all of his income and expenses on a Schedule C. If he has a safety net arrangement with the home congregation, that probably doesn't arise to the level of an employer-employee relationship in the eyes of the IRS, so he's all Schedule C. He can have a housing allowance, and there are ways to organize that. If you need more information, we can talk about it. Then there's the evangelist, and this sort of covers my situation, who works with the local congregation, and he is supported partly by the congregation where he works and partly by other congregations. The way that they had me do it after my interview with the IRS in 1992 was whatever came from my home congregation that I was actually working with, which was Buffalo, Missouri at the time. That was supposed to be treated like W-2 income, okay? But they didn't make me go back and amend the return. They didn't make the church go back and change that. They just said, okay, keep this in mind going forward. They let me that year put everything on a Schedule C. All the other money that I earned appropriately went on the Schedule C. And of course, back then, I was able to use the Schedule C to deduct expenses. Now, there's a clergy reduction amount that may appear on your tax return when you do Schedule C and you have a housing allowance. And the way that the IRS looks at that is, let's say you make $40,000 total, and $10,000 of that is designated as housing allowance. That means only $30,000 is actually going to be income taxable. So the IRS says 25% of your income is tax-free for income tax. So 25% of your expenses cannot be used. And that IRS has fought over that with various preachers and ministers for decades, and the ministers and preachers always lose. Every court case has found in favor of the IRS. I really got to hurry on. An evangelist working with a local congregation, but he is supported totally by other congregations. That's all Schedule C. An evangelist takes on a part-time job. This is kind of the situation I'm in. This is what several others have been in as a result of maybe driving school bus or doing other things to make extra money. The bottom line is the income is treated just as it would be normally in the secular world, and then the church income follows the rules that we've already outlined, whether you're a dual status employee or a Schedule C filer. The congregational teacher speaks at various congregations. He has the responsibility of reporting that income. He doesn't get a housing allowance because his work is not really the work of what the IRS defines as a minister. An example of preacher's compensation then, we're going to look at an example here. We have a base salary that is going to be income tax and self-employment taxable. We have a housing allowance that is only self-employment taxable, and an accountable plan that goes nowhere in reporting to the IRS. When the congregation at Ozark sets up my information for the 2025 year, it will be in the business meeting minutes, and I will have a letter that details this information, so I can show that to the IRS if need be. So the housing allowance is an exclusion from income tax, not from SE tax. Here's some examples. This is how it is calculated on what is called the clergy worksheet, which is in publication 517. Most of you know this from experience. If you need some guidance on this on a one-to-one basis, I'd be happy to give it to you. But you have a designated amount, you have your actual expenses, and you have fair rental value. Whatever's the smallest number is what you actually get. Here's the second scenario. You're designated $18,000 for the year, but your actual expenses are only $15,200. Well, then you report $15,200 as your housing allowance, and the rest goes into line 1H on the front page of the 1040 as additional income with a entry on the line excess allowance. Third example, designated amount, actual expenses. If your HVAC goes out one year, you might have a lot of extra expenses. And the church can modify your housing allowance through the year if they need to up it. And your fair rental value is $16,800. Which is pretty low in this day and time. Then we have $1,200 added back into taxable income on that line 1H. Now, this is what that W-2 would look like. This W-2 has got the box 1 amount is the actual wages, the base salary. Box 14 reports to the IRS the housing allowance. Withholding is not required for the dual status employee. But it can be done. This saved my life. When I started working at Ozark, they started withholding the taxes. Before that, I had big balance dues every year, year in, year out. had to go on installment agreements to get my taxes paid. Since I've been at Ozark, I think there was 1 year I had a balance due. I've gotten refunds because I calculate actually, what I need to have withheld. They withhold it, they pay it in, and my time is up, so I'm going to finish this thought, and then we'll get on to the Q&A, and maybe we'll have some questions. I'll even prompt you about some things you might want to ask about. But this is what a W-2 looks like when voluntary withholding is being done. Based on $30,000 of base income and $14,400, what we have there is income tax owing of about $1,160, and we have self-employment tax of a little over $6,100. That combines to make $7,538 is what I figured out, and you see they've got $7,500 already withheld, only $38 underwater or in the red when it comes to getting your tax bill paid on this income. So that's just for illustration purposes, and this is how it gets reported on a 941. We learned the hard way a couple years ago, you don't want to go over $10,000 withholding, or they'll switch you from quarterly to monthly payments. So what we did is a little over $9,000 gets paid in via withholding, and I do some estimated tax payments. Estimated tax payments, probably familiar to most of you, and it's a smaller amount, much smaller amount, and as estimated tax payments, make sure that I have plenty paid in at the end of the day. So I'm going to stop it right there. That's the form that you send in with your W-2 to the Social Security Administration, and these are the clergy worksheets. Business expenses, we might touch on that in the Q&A.